In 2024, a NASA plane sweeping radar across northern Greenland went looking for the bottom of the ice sheet. Instead, a dead city popped out of the scan, 100 feet down. Furnished rooms, a collapsed reactor chamber, streets carved into a glacier 800 miles from the North Pole. America built it in 1959, ran 200 men inside it, and powered it with a portable nuclear reactor. Then the ice crushed it, the Army walked away, and left the poison behind, certain it would stay buried forever. It won't, and still nobody agrees who cleans it up now. The scan came from a scientist named Chad Greene, flying a Gulfstream 3, mapping the base of the ice for a cryosphere survey. He wasn't hunting for anything human. "We were looking for the bed of the ice," his colleague Alex Gardner said, "and out pops Camp Century." A whole installation, flattened under decades of snow, lighting up the radar like a fossil in rock. The Army had spent 60 years assuming nobody would ever look at it again. One flight ended that. To understand how a nuclear-powered city ended up frozen inside a glacier, you have to start with a map and a fear. In the late 1950s, the shortest line between American weapons and Soviet cities ran straight over the top of the world. Greenland sat right on that line, remote, brutally cold, and hard for the Soviets to target. Eisenhower's strategists wanted something up there the enemy couldn't find and couldn't easily destroy. And the Army had an idea that sounded like science fiction. Don't build the base on the ice. Build it in the ice. So, in the summer of 1959, U.S. Army engineers hauled equipment 150 miles inland from Thule Air Base onto a plateau where the temperature dropped to 70 below and the wind hit 125 miles an hour. There was no town, no harbor, no runway waiting. There was just the ice sheet, 4 feet of new snow falling every year, and a plan. They dug with Swiss-built snow millers the men called Peter plows, machines that chewed long trenches straight down into the ice. Then they roofed each trench with corrugated steel arches and let the snow bury them again. Cut and cover. Underneath those arches, they assembled prefabricated wooden buildings, leaving a few feet of air on every side so the heat wouldn't melt the walls into slush. The largest trench they named Main Street. It ran more than 1,100 feet long, 26 feet wide, and 28 feet high, a boulevard of blue-white ice lit around the clock, because down there, the sun never rose and never set. By the time they finished, they had carved 21 tunnels, some accounts say 26, nearly 2 miles of them, at a cost of about $8 million. Inside sat barracks, a kitchen, a hospital, a chapel, a theater, a store, and a laboratory. The Army called it Camp Century and told the world it was an Arctic research community run by its Polar Research and Development Center. Journalists came. National Geographic came. The Saturday Evening Post ran a glowing profile. The Army even sent 2 Boy Scouts to stay there, one from Kansas, one from Denmark, and let them write home about the city under the ice. Almost none of it was the real reason. Camp Century was a test. The true project had a name the public wouldn't hear for another 36 years. Iceworm. The plan was to thread the ice cap with 2,500 miles of tunnels and hide up to 600 nuclear missiles down there, shuttling them along rail lines so the Soviets could never know which silo held what. Camp Century existed to answer one question. Could men live and build and run machinery inside a glacier long enough to make that work? There was a second secret, and it belonged to Denmark. Greenland was Danish territory, and Denmark had a strict public policy. No nuclear weapons on its soil. But in November 1957, Prime Minister H.C. Hansen had quietly handed the American ambassador, Val Peterson, a confidential letter that all but waved the nukes through without telling his own parliament. When Camp Century's publicity started spreading, Danish officials fell into what one account calls controlled panic, forced to insist there were no atoms under the ice, while the Americans built a reactor to prove otherwise. But the deepest problem wasn't political, it was physical, and it was already happening. The ice they'd chosen as their vault wasn't solid ground. It was a slow river, flowing downhill about 10 meters a year, folding and squeezing everything inside it. They had built their fortress out of the one thing that would not hold still. The thing that made Camp Century possible was a machine the Army insisted on calling portable. It weighed 330 tons. They named it the PM-2A, and it was the third child in a family of 8 experimental Army reactors, hauled to Thule in July 1960 and dragged in pieces across 150 miles of ice, each piece cut small enough to fit inside a C-130. In October, the engineers fired it up. The military's boast was pure atomic-age swagger. 44 pounds of uranium, they said, could replace more than 1 million gallons of diesel fuel. No convoys, no tanker sleds crawling across the ice, just a reactor in a trench, throwing off enough heat to run the lights and give 200 men as many hot showers as they wanted, while it was 70 below outside. That was the promise. The reality announced itself almost immediately. When they started the PM-2A, it began leaking radiation. The fix was not elegant. The men built shields out of lead sheeting and stacked walls of 55-gallon drums packed with ice and sawdust around the reactor, trying to hold the neutrons back with barrels. Once they got it running safely, the machine did its job for the better part of 3 years. But from the first week, the heart of the city was something the crew had to wall off from themselves. Above that reactor, a real town took shape. Down Main Street, under the humming lights, men walked to a barber shop, a library, a church service, a movie in the theater. A well melted deep into the ice, pulled up 10,000 gallons of fresh water a day. 14-inch air shafts were bored 40 feet into the tunnel floors to drag colder air in and keep the barracks from sweating. The Danish and Kansas Boy Scouts mailed letters describing hot food and warm bunks inside a glacier. To the outside world, it looked like the future, a self-contained community, proving Americans could live anywhere, even inside the Arctic itself. And while that story ran on television and in magazines, the base was quietly doing the work that actually mattered. Scientists led by drillers B. Lyle Hansen and Chester Langway were boring straight down through the ice sheet, pulling up a core nearly a mile long. They didn't fully know what they had. That frozen cylinder would later become the birthplace of an entire science, the first deep look into Earth's ancient climate. In the 1960s, it was just a side project at a missile test base. The most important thing to ever come out of Camp Century was being treated as a footnote. The missile plan itself was staggering on paper. Project Iceworm imagined a deployment zone roughly the size of Alabama, with as many as 2,100 launch positions, missiles kept at least 4 miles apart, moved constantly along buried rail so that destroying them would take a massive blanket Soviet strike. Up to 11,000 troops, 600 warheads. The Army's own reasoning, in later declassified documents, praised the ice cap's unique adaptability, remote, near Russia, hard to hit. Camp Century's 200 men were the small, real proof of concept for something meant to become one of the largest hidden weapons systems on the planet. There was just the problem of the ice. The men could feel it before anyone would admit it. The tunnels didn't hold their shape, the walls pressed inward, the ceilings sagged, and crews had to go out with tools and trim the ice back, over and over, just to keep the corridors open. The steel arches they'd been so proud of, the ones they'd nicknamed Wonder Arches, began to buckle. In the main trench and in Trench 20, instruments recorded the passages slowly narrowing and drooping under the weight of a glacier that would not stop moving. Then it reached the reactor room. By 1962, the ceiling above the PM-2A had lowered by about 5 feet. Think about that. A live nuclear reactor, and the roof of its chamber was descending onto it, foot by foot, because the ice around it flowed like cold tar. They shored it up. They kept trimming. But the core samples were now saying out loud what the deforming walls had been whispering. The sheet was moving fast enough that the whole installation would be unusable within a few short years. Everything about Camp Century had been sold as permanent. The reactor, the town, the mission that was supposed to outlast the Cold War itself. The men living inside it in 1962 could still get a hot shower, still watch a movie under the lights, still believe they were pioneering how the next war would be fought. They were living inside a machine that was already being crushed. They just hadn't been told yet. The ice made the decision before any general did. Core samples confirmed it. The sheet was flowing about 10 meters a year. The trenches had already compressed to their design limits within 4 years, and the tunnels meant to shuttle 600 missiles would misalign and crush faster than anyone could dig them. You cannot run a rail-mounted missile force through corridors that fold shut. So in 1963, Project Iceworm was quietly canceled. No enemy fired a shot. No committee in Washington killed it. A glacier did. The reactor went first. In 1963, they shut down the PM-2A and switched the camp to diesel. The next summer, they took the machine apart, and that's when the price came due. In a tunnel 40 feet under the ice, a Geiger counter screamed. The commanding officer, Joseph Franklin, grabbed the detector, ordered his men out, and did a fast survey before retreating. He estimated he'd stood for about 2 minutes in a radiation field of roughly 2,000 rads an hour, enough to make a man sick. When he got home, the Army sent him to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The reactor came out so hot, it was hauled back to the United States and buried in a nuclear waste dump in Idaho. But they didn't take everything. They took what they could carry. The rest stayed. The radioactive cooling water was left behind in a sump carved into the ice. The unlined pits full of sewage and gray water stayed. The diesel stayed. The polychlorinated biphenyls soaked into the building materials stayed. Camp Century ran on as a summer station for another year or two. Then the men left for good in the mid-1960s. The records say 1966. Some say 1967. A crew came back in 1969 just to check on it. The tunnels were already collapsing. And here is the part that mattered most to the people who abandoned it. They believed the ice would seal all of it away for eternity. In the 1960s, the phrase global warming hadn't even been coined. They weren't hiding the waste. They thought the glacier would swallow it and keep the secret forever, the same way it had swallowed the whole idea of Iceworm. For 30 years, it worked. Snow buried the camp roughly 100 feet deeper. The tunnels crushed flat, and the true purpose stayed classified until 1995, when a Danish inquiry, the Danish Institute of International Affairs, dug the documents out and finally told the public what Camp Century had really been built to do. The cover story died 3 decades after the base did. Then 2 things reached back up through the ice. The first came from that forgotten mile-long core. Its lowest section, 3.5 meters of frozen sediment scraped from the bedrock in 1966, had been lost for half a century, sitting mislabeled in a freezer in Copenhagen until a curator stumbled on it during an inventory in 2017. When scientists Andrew Christ and Paul Bierman finally analyzed it, they found something that stopped them cold. Twigs, leaves, bits of plants. Proof that the ground under Camp Century had been ice-free, green tundra within the last 1,000,000 years. The base's own accidental science had produced the one fact that condemns its tomb. This ice has melted before. It can melt again. The second thing was the arithmetic of what's still down there. In 2016, a team led by glaciologist William Colgan produced the first real inventory. The waste field covers about 136 acres, roughly 100 football fields. Inside it were some 53,000 gallons of diesel, on the order of 6 million gallons of sewage and gray water, PCBS, and low-level radioactive coolant. Colgan's climate modeling found that under a high-emissions future, the site could tip from gaining ice to losing it around 2090, and the waste could begin working its way back toward the surface before the century is out. They thought it would never be exposed, Colgan said. The question now, he said, is whether what's down there is going to stay down there. That single study reopened a wound between allies. Greenland's foreign minister at the time, Vitus Kujawkitsok, demanded to know who was responsible. The United States built it. Denmark permitted it in secret. Greenland has to live above it. No one has clearly agreed to pay. A weapon aimed at the Soviet Union has become a slow argument between friends about a mess nobody wants to own. So go back to that NASA plane, sweeping its radar in 2024, watching a dead city rise out of the scan 100 feet down. It was never supposed to be seen again. The men who left it believed the ice was a vault with no door. But the glacier that crushed their fortress is now the only thing holding their poison in place, and it is beginning to let go. The city is still down there. The ice is still moving. And this time, it's moving up.